I hate comic book movies, is what I would have said back in the 90s, when superhero blockbusters were limited to underdeveloped Batman sequels, Superman cash grabs, and over-the-top R-rated supernatural flicks. The comic-based movie industry was a wasteland until one film cleared the mist and revitalized the genre. And that film was the X-Men. The first one, from 2000. The movie that gave Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen another notch in their bedposts, and made Hugh Jackman a household name.
Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. How dare he?
X-Men differentiated itself from the mass of superpowered garbage by grounding the material and characters in the real world, the world the audience knew, and injecting nuance and depth into the plot and antagonist, Magneto. Both these elements are currently staples of any good superhero film, but that wasn't always the case. X-Men was the feature that showed the world these basics of storytelling could be used in comic movies, fundamentally shaping how superhero movies are made. Or at least that's what I and many other contemporary film buffs think. So in honor of Nando v Movie's new series, One X-Cellent Scene, encouraging YouTubers to discuss their favorite moments across all X-Men properties, I'll be dissecting a scene from the first X-Men movie that I feel captures how the film impacted modern cinema as we know and love it today. And that scene is the very first thing you see when you turn on the movie. Magneto's origin as a European Jewish child during the Holocaust in 1944. As a refresher for those of you who haven't seen the movie in a while, X-Men opens as a group of Jewish prisoners are separated into two groups. One destined to become workers, the other to be herded into concentration camps. A guard tears a young Magneto from his mother and ushers her toward the death camp end of the fork. In a fit of tears and hysteria as the gates close behind his mother's crowd, Magneto unleashes his powers, crushing the metal gate while Nazi soldiers restrain him. It's a traumatizing and gripping moment that shakes you. It's astonishing that something this powerful exists only an hour away from the utterance of one of the worst or best lines in cinematic history.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
It makes you wish the rest of the film was that scene developed into a solo Magneto Origin movie. From today's vantage, we're used to seeing heavy and poignant moments in our popcorn media. Peter Parker trapped under rubble in Spider-Man Homecoming, Captain America waking up after being frozen and proclaiming he had a date.
I had a date.
Pa Kent stopping Superman from saving him from the tornado. The Avengers' mixed reactions of fear and acceptance while fading away after the Thanos snap.
I don't want to go. I don't want to go, sir. Please. Please, I don't want to go. I don't want to go.
The point is, as audiences, we've come to accept and expect scenes grounded in realism and sincere emotion in superhero movies. But as some of you may remember, that wasn't a thing in the 1990s and the years before. After the massive amounts of disappointing Batman and Superman sequels flooded box offices, comic book movies became a joke. The genre was mainly seen as hyper-realistic, dystopian, and cartoonish, not meant to do anything more than entertain their demographic range of children to adrenaline-filled teens. The closest thing to realism we had was Tim Burton's 1989 Batman. But even that, with its surreal style and Prince dance sequence, failed to capture the gravity of its thoughtful and grounded inspiration. Essentially, the 90s was a time marred by fast cuts, quick action, and cheesy jokes. Nothing beyond the surface. So imagine being someone within that edgy demographic, walking into a theater to see X-Men, expecting to watch Wolverine slash his knives around for an hour and a half. But instead, you're greeted with a chilling reminder of one of the darkest moments in human history. If X-Men was trying to keep within the status quo to appease the standard superhero movie patrons who weren't interested in an introspective look at morality, the filmmakers would have stuck to the hypermasculine and pop art styles of the films that came before. But that's not what the writer and director of the film did. Instead of falling in line with the superhero flick stereotypes, he focused on the thematic merit of the property in a substantial way.
I think beneath the costumes and the spectacle and the fighting and the fun, there's an underlying philosophy about prejudice, about feeling outcast, fear of the unknown, trying to find your place in the world, very universal concepts that people have been attracted to.
They're not simple moral quandaries, but issues with no definite solutions that the characters experience along with the audience. This Magneto origin scene helped establish a tone of realism by placing the movie within our own world and a historical context we know. It establishes that the evil in the narrative isn't vampires, or a demon John Leguizamo, or a woman who controls flowers and makes plant puns. The evil is what everyday people are capable of. By reminding us of the malicious sides of humanity, it sets the stage for a movie that isn't focused on fighting, but on a philosophical conversation about revenge, trauma, prejudice, and isolation. It separated the movie from what was available at the time while showing us that superhero films don't have to be just silly black and white battles with overpowered villains, but they can tackle and make accessible existential issues we're all affected by, while also throwing superpowers into the mix. This heart-wrenching moment also differentiated and elevated the film through which character they chose to feature in the intro. They didn't show Wolverine's or Professor X's origin. They showed the quote-unquote villain's backstory. This defining moment provided context for Magneto's character and allowed the audience to better understand his motives going forward. It confuses any preconceptions that the villain should strictly be the bad guy and forces you to empathize and root for him through the film in a strange sort of way. By including this scene at the top, they actually make Magneto the most fleshed out character in the film. As a person who periodically watched the first X-Men movie through her formative years, I had this crazy idea that the movie depicted fully formed characters and relationships. Before rewatching the film to make this video, I was super excited to visit the protective dynamic between Wolverine and Rogue, the Jean Grey Wolverine-Cyclops love triangle, and the blossoming romance of Rogue and Iceman. But I got none of that. Instead, I was faced with the rude realization that most of the film is pretty thin in terms of character development, where almost everyone is limited to a couple of words and no real defining features.
You gonna tell me to stay away from me, girl?
Well, if I had to do that, she wouldn't be my girl.
But Magneto has such a compelling introduction that he basically becomes the heart of the movie. He's the one set up for you to empathize with by showcasing his beginnings. This practice of representing your antagonist as not a bad guy, but as a complex and flawed character is not unique when looking at today's movies, especially superhero movies. The Vulture in Spider-Man Homecoming was a working man trying to provide for his family. Thanos was doing what he thought was right based on his past to prevent overpopulation from stuffing out life in the universe. Ozymandias in Watchmen wanted to create world peace by uniting countries against a common enemy. The list goes on. And by the way, I'm only referring to movies here, not the books in which these movies are based on. That's a whole different side of the story that I'm going to be covering later in this video. Going back, again, before the turn of the century, sympathetic villains weren't common in superhero movies and otherwise. Why was Hans Gruber so unspeakably evil in Die Hard? What motivated the bullies in Stand By Me to be so vicious to the main group of kids? Why did Joker want to kill Batman and rule Gotham in the 1989 Batman movie? Was Lex Luthor propelled by anything other than his lust for real estate? Even the best movies, the most iconic ones you can think of, neglected to flesh out the villains. They were just these shapeless beings that were bad for the sake of being bad. But not in X-Men. Right out the gate, they gave Magneto a tangible reference for his philosophies. They provided enough of an explanation for him to not be the villain, but an anti-hero. Not acting out of selfishness or malevolence, but doing what he believed needed to be done for the greater good. Given the massive amounts of money the film raked in and its high ratings, it was a proof of concept that comic book movies didn't have to dumb down character motivations to appeal to the lowest common audience member. Additionally, it encouraged future comic book filmmakers to play with this idea of a tortured hero with a sympathetic rationale on the big screen. An influence that can clearly be seen in Sandman from Spider-Man 3, who turned to crime to provide a better life for his daughter. Or Syndrome from The Incredibles, where rejection and humiliation from his hero fueled him to cheat and murder his way into the hearts of the public.
I only wanted to help, and what did you say to me?
Fly home, buddy. I work alone.
At this point in the video, I feel compelled to mention that this discussion of how the X-Men set the stage for villain rationales and basing superhero stories on real-world emotional conflict is only applicable to the movie version of the property. Creating relatable and nuanced narratives addressing human truths and the ambiguous nature of morality is nothing new in the pages of comics, particularly with the characters developed and penned by Jack Kirby. Characters like the X-Men, Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man. Side note, I know people like to solely credit Stan Lee for making these characters, but Kirby and Lee were actually partners in creating them. Most people, including myself who are into the comic book community and history, contend that Lee muscled Kirby out of a lot of his credit when Kirby was the real brains behind the operation. It's a long story, and Lee seemed nice enough, but I don't think he deserves all the praise he got. This topic is a different video for a different day though, so I'm sorry if anyone disagrees with me, but I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Anyway, going back to one excellent scene, the bedrock of many Kirby stories were the concepts of dejection, perspective, hopefulness, and understanding.
Well, the characters represent a sort of a transcendent feeling that we all have inside us, that we could do better.
Fantastical elements grounded by real-world emotion and relatable internal conflict. This aimed to reflect universal truths and contradictions extended to how he created villain characters like Magneto. The X-Men were developed in response to prejudice against marginalized groups, and feelings of isolation and being ostracized. Thus, the strong political overtones and the detail that mutant powers tend to reveal themselves during puberty, a time typically associated with fear, change, and loneliness. In terms of how Kirby related to these themes, outside of being a human, Kirby was a Jewish American drafted to fight in World War II. While in Europe, he helped emancipate a small concentration camp abandoned by German soldiers, where he witnessed the human and morbid consequences of the Holocaust. Kirby described his experience stating, "They looked like they hadn't eaten for I don't know how long. They were scrawny. Their clothes were all tattered and dirty. The German soldiers didn't give a shit for anything. They just left the place, just like leaving a dog behind to starve. I was standing there for a long time just watching, thinking to myself, what do I do? Just thinking about it makes my stomach turn." The combination of Kirby's experience with a Nazi concentration camp, his Jewish culture, and the civil rights movement of the 60s fueled Magneto's backstory as a Holocaust survivor who had lost his family in the massacre and wanted to protect mutants from potentially facing the same fate.
Women and children, whole families destroyed simply because they were born different from those in power. Well, after tonight, the world's powerful will be just like us. They will return home as mutants. Our cause will be theirs.
Along with being a compelling and tragic origin, it propels the themes the X-Men were created to address. The X-Men filmmakers' pioneering decision to include a scene that overtly displayed the comic's historical context in an unflinching way was a bold move, but a brilliant one. I feel the power of this scene gave future comic book filmmakers license to accurately reflect the nuts and bolts of their source material, not just the character names and powers. Additionally, I argue that it introduced comic books as legitimate literature and a form of social commentary to people who previously saw them as exclusively a joke or geek or kid stuff. Looking back on the film now as a person living in 2020, X-Men had its flaws. It's riddled with underdeveloped dynamics, messy plot structure, nothing characters, and some of the silliest dialogue I have ever heard.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning?
Huh?
But if you look past that, it's a sophisticated and cutting-edge marvel that advocated the importance of theme to narrative. The Magneto scene beautifully reflects the core of what made this film so revolutionary. Its ability to elevate the genre and break stereotypes while showing audiences and executives what comic book movies could be. I think that this scene single-handedly enhanced the movie, helping it reach the next level of three-dimensionality that made X-Men so influential, making this one excellent scene. Alright, so now that we're done with the analysis, if you want to hear more of my thoughts on comic book movies, you can check out my One Marvelous Scene video, or my One Decent Scene project I created to highlight some of DC's flops and not flops. My One Decent Scene video dissects the Save the Cat scene from 1978 Superman. Yeah, you know, the moment where a little girl gets beat because of Superman.
Mommy! Frisky was stuck in a tree. This man swooped out of the sky and gave him to me. Haven't I told you to stop telling lies?
Yep, that's right. That's in the movie. There's also a whole playlist of other creators talking about their own favorite or least favorite DC scenes that you can check out. We're always looking for One Decent Scene submissions, so I highly encourage y'all to make your own videos and tweet them to me at 500 Days of Ariana so I can add them to the playlist. I'll put all the videos and playlists mentioned in the description of this video and in the cards. At this point, I'd like to thank my patrons Matt, David, and Patrick. Thank you guys so much for your support. I really appreciate it. If you, the viewer, also want to support my channel, you can subscribe, like this video, and or donate to my Patreon. The link is in the description below. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.